Dr. Flick, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor and pleasure to introduce the second panel. And as usual, I would like to come back to what we have talked about the last 2 days. There are 2 aspects I would like to underline in particular. Yesterday and this morning, we pondered the question of the consequences of technological development, in particular big data, in view of a potentially dangerous power constellation of particular companies. And the buzzwords here were Facebook and Google. And we talked about the question whether both are powerful companies or whether they are too powerful, whether they can be split like Standard Oil. I mean, of course, we know that we need different approaches here, but is there a possibility of state control if it gets too exuberant? Or maybe Google isn't as powerful as it seems, and maybe we just have to intervene a bit so that Google and Facebook users reorient or in order to trigger more competition. So whatever can be done on the market by people who are creative is what we talked about. Now, that was one of the big issues we talked about, but then we also focused on the European drama, the Euro crisis in particular. And here we, of course, see the problem of power and powerlessness in a particular context. Albrecht Ritschl's presentation has clearly shown what all this is about. Germany, what role does Germany play? A hesitating hegemonic power facing debts and debt cuts, and having done so for 200 years. Now, there are different ideas and theories people venture. Some say that Greece has always been rather weak and is thus the innocent victim today. Who has the power? Who is powerless in the drama? That's the question. And then negotiation power, or the negotiating power. That's another buzzword. I mean, what is it? Where does it come from? Who holds it? Let me give you an example. These are the negotiations between the Greek government and the European partners. And often the media compared the negotiations with a car's race, the car's race in the film where Jim Stark and Buzz Gunderson meet in order to embark on a race, and they both race and they approach the abyss, and if none of them stops, they will both die. But you cannot really compare the negotiations in Europe to the film. But I would like to remind you of what Schäuble said on 28 midnight. It will be over, he said, and he said it in his Swabian dialect, but it was not over. And actually, the negotiations have become a series, and the question is, of course, what will be the last deadline? But there is no such last deadline. Remember, the ECB got involved in May 2010, and it renewed its promise again last summer, and finally it offered loans to Greece. The question is the bank a powerful bank? Thomas Schelling played a certain role. He was a legal advisor in America, and he focused on game theory. And he said that he who seems to be powerful and can act in many different ways might be the powerless one. In other words, the ECB has embarked on the role of the victim. Of course, it has its guns, its cannons even, but this is not the right way to go in negotiations, because you must be capable of saying no as well. All these aspects could be discussed in a panel debate, but before we talk, I would like to introduce the panelists. I don't have to introduce Dr. Flick, though, because she is our host, and she was our host in the past as well. She's the one who gets all these interesting people together for very interesting talks. So I won't introduce her, but I would like to thank her for getting us here time and again. Professor Dr. Thomas Hören. He's a lawyer focusing on information, media, and business law. Until 2014, he was the dean of the law faculty of the University of Münster. Ambassador, Professor Dr. Wolfgang Ischinger, chairman of the Munich Security Conference. So you all know him from the media, from media coverage, television, and so on. He's a member of many supervisory boards and institutions. And he's also a professor of the Hertie School of Governance. Mr. Rich, who I've known for a long time. We studied together in Munich, and I'm very much looking forward to our debate. Thank you, Mr. Conrad. Well, would you want to start? Well, I might be considered the memento mori. I won't talk about Greece. Yeah, well, actually, we will talk about the power of politics. Well, actually, I'm interested in the failure of nation states, and I'm interested in the new players, the ones who have started being important agents. That's Google, Facebook, and others. They have created a new currency, that's data, and it's really difficult to quantify the data, but the market value of Google is as much as the market value of the Federal Republic of Germany, i.e. Google is an extremely powerful corporation. And then we have to see the power of the powerlessness, because there are counter worlds and new currencies come into being, bitcoins, for example, which is extremely dangerous. But then there are also shitstorms, as you all know, these storms of revenge, i.e. the powerless get together and they can set up their own blogs and thus create counter publicity, which is good, but which can also be very dangerous, as you might remember from our talks about Dieter Nuhr and others who were subject matters of reports of the FAZ. Any immediate reaction? Right. We talked about the creativity of the market, and does the market know how to deal with it? Maybe too powerful. And there are a number of examples that show that 10 years ago, we would not have thought that SAP would get major competitors. Who would have thought that IBM would lose its position of dominance in the market one day? And there is a lot of speculation with respect to the future of Google. Bitcoin, if I may say so. Bitcoin is an internal currency. It's not a currency created by an external fiscal institutions or monetary institution. And here, too, we are dealing with value fluctuations, changing values, and so on. But it's nothing new. Actually, Bitcoin is nothing new because we have known a number of monetary substitutes. You might remember bonds in the Middle Ages, which became increasingly important in Italy, for example. All this has always been important for the monetary theory. The French Revolution also had these titles as, or saw these titles as a means to do something about inflation. So Bitcoin is new, but it's not that new. Well, I'm very happy to hear you say that you have not understood it, that you have not quite understood it. I don't understand it either. But we are looking at a global world, and we are looking at new powers and power structures that are very different from what we are used to see. So the power is getting powerless. Well, we are indeed dealing with a disintegration of the power. And we are dealing with dysfunctional decision-making structures, and we are dealing with power diffusion, and we are dealing with new instruments, new tools to exercise power. He who has the data has the power. That's today. It used to be different in the past, like to me. Give you another example, following up on your presentation. In the U.S. Department of Finance for some time, there has been a huge department dealing with the weaponization of finance, as I would call it. In other words, how do I use financial policy means, that's sanctions, first of all, of course, so that I don't have to throw bombs or use other military means. And that's another new form to exercise power on a global scale, which is being renegotiated. So we are dealing with the disintegration of power. The German Minister of Foreign Affairs recently said in a TV show that everything seems to be disintegrating. Roger Cohen wrote an op-ed in the New York Times with the title "The Great Unraveling," which confirms my impression that in spite of the fact that globalization requires more global decision-making, and in spite of the fact that there are many more players, it's not nation-states only, it's also NGOs and Google and Facebook, i.e., in spite of the multiplication of players, the international community is less and less capable of taking decisions. The summits don't work. G8 doesn't work. So we do have a problem here. Yeah, right. I mean, this might be a way to see things. Being an economist, I'd like to say that the private sector and the public sector should go hand in hand. In other words, governments establish framework conditions so that private companies can work and or flourish. But sometimes politicians tend to think that they could also take over. This is what I also hear from neighboring sciences like more state, less market. I always wonder, what do you mean by less state? I can imagine a market with a well-working state, and I'm a bit more optimistic than you are, it seems. Yeah, but let me come back to my argument, because there is a huge number of international conflicts which are as yet unsolved. And the number of international conflicts is increasing. We have even reached a world record currently, 60 million people are refugees in this world. We are counting 60 million refugees, and this is unprecedented, and many of them in Europe, if you include countries in the Middle East, Syria and others. So the global system doesn't work. Mr. Ritschel, I mean, Mr. Ischinger says it doesn't work. You said before power structures have become dysfunctional. Could you also call it a vacuum, a void? Or are there enough bodies so that there seems to be power? I'm a lawyer. Let me intervene. And I do see a particular problem, and I'm surprised that people still feel confidence. The system does not begin, it ends with states, and we don't have enough tools. And in terms of the international law, we are powerless, absolutely powerless. Look at the refugee problem. I mean, look at the helplessness of German politicians in view of Google. I mean, Mr. Gabriel says, let's destroy Google. That's what he said in California. And Mrs. Aigner said, well, I will give back my Facebook account. That's a clear indication of helplessness, and that's what we feel all over, and that's also due to the lack of instruments and tools. I'm not sure whether we lack the tools. What about regulation or regulatory tools? I'm rather thinking that we are facing the disappearance of power asymmetries. I was born in 1959. And actually, the world I've known was a well-structured one. When I was a child, I saw U.S. military convoys on the motorways near Munich. And I also grew up some time in Frankfurt. And I mean, the world was a clearly structured one. And we did not need any emergency constitution, and we did not need to refer to Carl Schmitt or Herrenhausen or others. Now, you mentioned the hegemonic forces, and the Ersatz candidates of the hegemonic forces have difficulties in filling the gap. I'm living in London, and here the media tends to pretend that Europe is having major problems in moving forward, but I still don't know whether this is due to lacking tools. Maybe it's rather about terrorist arms which work better than the arms made available to the soldiers of the German army. So the question is, what is it about? Mr. Ischinger, financial tools or tools and measures in the field of finance, politics, what would that be? Well, let me step back and look once again at the question, what are the causes? What are the reasons? And what can we do in order to combat them, in order to fight this alleged disintegration? We might be capable of realizing that after decades of a rather static situation on a global scale, things are changing fast today. Maybe someone would like to contest my statement, but I would like to say that we are at the beginning of major global changes. Look at China. China used to be the sleeping giant for decades, forever silent, and all of a sudden it has become the new world power, at least from the U.S. perspective. And it's the only rival to be taken seriously on a global scale, which has its implications on politics and on the question, what is the goal of the exercise of power? I mean, do we want to have the status quo again, the original euro? Should it be maintained, safeguarded, protected? So do we just want to keep the status quo? Is that the goal we are pursuing? I think that if we do so, we will fail. We will sink and drown because there is a global trend we won't be able to stop. Let me give you a figure to show what I mean. Those who believe that the numbers of refugees coming to Europe today have reached a peak or will reach a peak soon, and that the problem will then disappear soon, should remember that according to all forecasts, I know the number of people living in Africa will increase from 1 to 3 billion in the next few years, since nobody believes that the economic power of African nations will develop sufficiently. We will be in a situation unprecedented because the situation won't improve. It will even worsen. So we will have to bear in mind that things will be very different in the future. The debate is a bit difficult because we are mixing three topics, I'd say. On the one hand, I would like to come back to the optimism I mentioned with respect to the question whether Google and Facebook will be the main problem in the midterm. Secondly, we are dealing with the problem of security and geopolitics, but I don't want to comment on these themes because I'd rather talk about topics I know something about. And thirdly, we are talking about the euro crisis. Now, of course, these topics are connected, and we might come back to the latter in particular, because you are experts here. But the question is, of course, to what extent is it important that Europe appears as a joint and powerful and strong player? And to what extent can we manage to do so? And what about Greece? Greece was quite important in our debate yesterday. But I would like to underline that I was a bit surprised about the debate. Cyprus has about 500,000 inhabitants, is about as big as Cologne, is about as economically powerful as Cologne, is looking for a sponsor. looks at Russia, but Russia does not approach Cyprus. Russia so far has not said, I would like to deploy my military in Cyprus and I will feed 500,000 hungry mouses. But this has not happened. Now, Russia is looking at Greece with 10 million inhabitants and in a difficult situation for some time. But actually, it doesn't make a difference whether you have your military harbor in Athens or on Cyprus as far as geopolitics are concerned. But the Russians did not intervene in Cyprus. Why should they intervene in Greece or help Greece?
Yeah.
Well, you know, my answer is, unfortunately, I have to put it like this. It's not about Greece. I presume it is in strategic terms about the question, how do people see Europe and Europe's future? Now, a Brexit, no matter whether it's voluntary or involuntary, a Brexit would have an impact on Serbia, Kosovo, and Albania. That is in all this, in all of this unstable region. It would give them the feeling that there is no benefit or no use of the euro. So if a member of the EU, a long-standing member of the EU, leaves, now is that something which I might call a disintegration? This is probably a feeling which these countries will develop. On top of that, a decision like this would be a corroboration of what people, let's say in Russia or Moscow, say, that European integration is part and parcel of the increasingly decadent West. So now I juxtapose Russia, a newly strengthened nationalism, national sovereignty, which is based on old traditional values which are not decadent. So I think we'd have done Putin a big favor with this Brexit, and I'm happy that we haven't done so. Does that answer your, say, proposition?
Would that be an answer to your proposition? Mr. Ritschel, would you like to comment?
Well, yes. I think we should have some questions from the floor.
Edin Zacher aus München. Ich bin
Edin Zacher. I have a dependence on Google, although Google will not feel that. Anyway, my question is aimed at this proposition that we've got companies like Google or Facebook and that we should control them. And what about the past? Has it ever been like this, that there were companies who which located in other countries were controlled by introducing any, say, executive or judicial measures? Now, isn't it all about governments? You know, governments are do no longer agree, particularly when it comes to data protection, what the best solution is. And, you know, Mrs. Merkel is always quoted in the press. You know, she doesn't stand up against that or, say, raise her finger if her own data are, say, disclosed, then something happens, but nothing happens when many people are affected. You see, the milk has been spilled already. We've had a 20-year discussion, Silicon Valley, and, you know, Google has developed over many years, and we shouldn't, you know, say it's a bad company. We owe them a lot, and maybe we have no forums. We have no forums for any quality discussions. We have got a completely different data protection idea in comparison with the Americans. They've got another tradition in this respect. So we forced the Americans to stick to European data protection standards. But that's great. But who is supposed to, put this into effect in the United States? Will it be, Mr. Gabriel? How can he say destroy or dismantle Google in America? And we have introduced several measures, and it also means that we always preach the normative fact of what is practicable. So at present, we've got many companies from the Silicon Valley. The panel is exuding doom and gloom, all the things that don't work and things that are disintegrating. But there's one thing which is obvious. What we need is a new governance, new global governments. You may say the United Nations, we've seen that. We are not, nothing had worked, Security Council, etc., etc. But there are approaches and examples which work when people having different kinds of interests see a common benefit, WTO and China. Now, if you say that international global trade is a benefit for both parties, if you follow certain rules, having this legal discourse with China, people will invest if they are, say, protected by law. The G20, if you look at improvement of the Bretton Woods system or others, then I'm sure that there are approaches which you can follow or strengthen. How can you strengthen them? We can do so by introducing soft power, i.e. you have attractive models which are not only of benefit to people but also to the regimes, because in the mid and the long term the development will go this way. In the short term, of course, people are fallible because they are the dictators who say, I'm not really interested in what people feel, but I believe that this, say, sad worldview is something which you can counter. Well, in principle, I would like to agree. Doom and gloom might not be the right notion for us. If you look at the refugees coming over the Mediterranean, they are not going to Russia. They're not going to Iran. They are not going to Saudi Arabia. And they are not on their way to the new caliphate. They are on their way to Europe. So in this respect, there must be some kind of attractivity coming from our countries, so not everything is lost. But what we also see is the loss of controllability. And this is what I was talking about. I am not talking about controllabilities all the time, and my friend Konrad will contradict. I'm talking about controlling controls, that is, control of an institution over another institution. Now, if there were a European integration process, and then this might also mean that Mr. Schäuble is a loser in all of this Greek discussions, then we might end up in a situation which we didn't envisage in the beginning. So this might happen. So when in political terms, self-control or not self-control, then, we might have different repercussions or results. The economists among us know that, if you look at various enterprises or companies, and, you have got a Google, and then you have an IBM, or you have a Microsoft. These were, say, the big companies of the past, and, China went up and Japan went down. This up and down, this is a regularity which we will observe again and again. We do not see it immediately, instantly, because sometimes things like this do not happen in one go. The decline of a country like the United Kingdom, for instance, you see. Now, here you have a threat of an internal disintegration process. No one really thought about that. So lots of unusual things are happening at present, but we do not want to have.
Nichts von Gloom.
There was no gloom and doom during the 2 days we talked.
Well, let me add to that. We do not want to stop with this doom and gloom analysis. I would like to quote Jun Nai. He said, in this postmodern world, which we are moving into, power together with others might be more important than having power over others. And this brings me back to the European Union. You know, my attempt to answer these instabilities is the hope that based on or as a result of the current crisis, we will be able to come up with a uniform, stronger European Union which is able to take decisions and put them into effect. So a more efficient and a more powerful decision-making structures, and at the end of the day, therefore, power. Well, yes, divided power, power with many others, but you know, this might enable us to shape the future. I think there's one thing, I believe this is quite right what you said and what our colleague over there said. Internet regulation, you see, there seem to be conflicts or power conflicts, and they seem to dissolve because classical structures of decision-making committees are dissolved. And suddenly we've got these soft decision makers. Look at the internet, the ITU, the International Telecommunication Union. This, we never really knew anything about it. And suddenly it plays an important role when it comes to internet regulation. So obviously new decision-making structures emerge. And this is a kind of hope which we should take home, that something is going on, that something is happening beyond Europe.
Frage, ganz hinten, bitte.
One more question.
Wolfgang Schnell, Unternehmen.
Wolfgang Schnell, entrepreneur. Question to Professor Ritschl. I followed very closely, and you know, I listened very carefully to what you said about this bailout for Greece. It was a bit critical. This is what I read between the lines. But what would the scenario be if there were no such bailout and if we leave Greece alone? So what are the scenarios which scientists may come up with? Well, I think you need not be a scientist. Every one of you know, in structural terms, the Greece are bankrupt, that it's always about shifting debts, and it's just about the creditor or the debtor rather, suggesting ways of solving this problem. So as long as this does not happen, then Greece will default on its debts. Now, what I did was, you know, this. I think I called it a wild bailout. Now, if that is not structured, so then another model is what Mr. Fust suggested: solidarity increase, or we just take away a few percentage points from another tax and call it a solidarity fund for Greece. This is how we could pay. But this still does not answer your question. What will happen if we don't do all these things? Then there are two solutions. Fiscal crisis, the Greek default on their debts. This is a Greek crisis. And somebody, you know, stops, say, transmitting money to Greece. This is a question which has arisen recently. Is that something the ECB is allowed or should do? This is being discussed in a very controversial manner, actually. And the question again is about the difference or the distinction between fiscal and monetary policy. And, you know, ECB and, you know, being an assistant to the German financial ministry, is that possible? So if the Greeks don't do that, then we will stop transmitting money. So this means they're going to issue a parallel currency, and then they are out. You know, this is something which we call an unordered or disorderly Grexit. But what happens if we keep up money supply? Then, of course, we'd have an interesting situation. We'll have these, say, slum-ridden population. And of course, Mr. Varoufakis, on his motorbike, could come back to the finance ministry again. You know, because then he can start working on his debt default. Now, whether or not this was a photo collage that is showing the middle finger to our finance minister, you know, so they could start defaulting on their debts without leaving the Eurozone. Not easy, but of course, we do not know how many of these government debts will, you know, default. Whether we're talking about Greek banks, I don't know whether how many of these banks will survive. Let us remember the dollar before the American Civil War. We had several state bankruptcies, and nobody helped them. Not Mr. Schäuble, not any other central bank, for instance, because they didn't have a central bank at the time in the United States. So nobody helped them. This is a highly interesting situation. Unfortunately, not a very favorable solution when using this as an example for today's situation, because the result was a world financial crisis, 1857, 1907, and another crisis, which was an indirect repercussion of or consequence of the earthquake in San Francisco. So we'd have a Varoufakis euro, and this means debt would be eliminated, and all those non-payers could also take part, and this is what it is then. Let me follow up on that. I asked this quite, say, rather provocative question. You know, if Greece leaves the EU, then nothing has to be paid for them. Oh, that's interesting. The second part of your question is not quite sure, because we do not know, you know, the costs. You know, we cannot let this country starve. Then, you know, this was talked about in Berlin for quite some time. Contingent plan for making sure that emergency supplies are sent there so that they can still pay their oil invoices, that they still have lights on, etc. And, you know, if we stop transmitting money there, then this is one side. But on the other hand, using some planes, sending medication or drugs to them, to their hospitals. So again, this brings me back to this powerlessness, because we'd have a situation which is really not good, and I'm sure Mrs. Merkel will not follow that approach.
There are more questions here.
I have a very simple question. Why, on a European level, why can we not come up with, say, a redistribution of, say, funds? Okay, let's ask people here. Who is in favor of a European redistribution? In favor? Against? So this is the answer. Thank you. About this question. Now, so for 20 years, we have tolerated something in Germany and now export this system to other European countries. I don't think that this will work. In the past, we had a comparison between Greece and Bremen in Germany. People made a comparison like this. That is Bremen, our small Greece. And if you use this as an example, then you can extrapolate things. This might go well for quite some time, like Mr. Ritschl said, but there will be controversies, there will be dissatisfaction, and Mr. Kuryutka can tell you how many proceedings are pending and how many will be pending, and to what extent this financial redistribution led to lots and lots of controversies in Germany.
Mein Name ist Uli Bader.
Uli Bader. I'm working in the cultural sector, talking about technology, policy, and power. How can we bring all this together? From Stanford or Silicon Valley, from there we heard that there is a daring vision that we don't need any politicians anymore. And this is because we have algorithms, etc., and computers, because they are going to take over making these decisions. What's your opinion? What do you think of this daring, say, proposition? Well, yes. I think a week ago we had a legal advisor, and he talked about this scenario, really, but against this backdrop, that is tax consultants, etc., etc. You know, maybe the last profession will be the politician's profession. This is one scenario, of course. And of course, it's always great to speculate about the future, but we can also think about our own, say, intellectual abilities. That is, what will we do? Because there might be technologies which will take over from us, you know. And the future Kasparov, with his extended brain skills, well, he may then be in a position to win against Big Blue. Quite interesting. Unfortunately, I will not, live until I can see a situation like that. I think this is a wonderful question. I would like to give you a provocative answer. I try a definition. A crisis happens if all the algorithms will be switched off at the push of a button. And then the second proposition from my presentation, here the sovereign has to take a decision whether or not to, press the button. Talking about problems, then we might say it will be critical to replace risk management by these algorithms. Circle. I don't know, an Apple or Google Inside, or maybe both together, here it is said that a system can be created which will take all decisions. This is a system which is feasible. You see, we talked about expert systems, artificial intelligence, no problem. But there's something you said, Angela will not do that, or Mrs. Merkel is not going to do that. I'm going to remember that. We will not do that. This is something which I think, because maybe we need this emergency switch or something like this. It will be feasible, it is doable, but we won't do it.
Right, I think this has been a lot of input, and you have also learned that CONVOCO is very important in a changing world. So I would like to thank the panel. It's been an exciting debate.